publisher kept contacting me every day saying, this guy wrote this book on vampires. You need to get him on your show. Yeah. And after about 2 months of every day getting an email from them, I decided to have him on a show. And I don't know if you ever had a guest. It came from hell. But I had this guest on, and, I introduced him. We started talking, and I asked him about his book. He goes, well, I don't want to talk about my book. I don't want to give any of the plots of my book away. And I started thinking, well, gee, you approached me, your publishers approached me about being on my show to talk about your book. Now you don't want to talk about your book. And I had him booked for 2 hours. I didn't even have a backup guest that night. I started talking about every zombie movie it was ever made for 2 hours while he said one or two words every 20 minutes. You know what? At the end of the day, I was really panicking. I mean, it was a show that was the worst show I've ever had in all my years in broadcasting. But you know what? The next morning, I started looking at the ratings, how many people tuned in, and all the people actually enjoyed it. And they said, the humor I put on, well, it was 2 hours of me sweating bullets, talking BS for 2 hours just to keep the, I mean, what are you going to do? Say, hey, I have nothing to talk about. You have nothing to talk about. Well, hey, good night, everybody.
Well, I think the worst guests I've ever had are the ones that just simply, no matter how much you talk to them, no matter how much you spend time with them and you ask them the questions, they just kind of stop. And now you got dead air there for a moment and you're like, okay, well, I've got to get this guest talking or do something. I like to call them the short statement guests. I'm sure you've had a few yourself. You're in the middle of talking to them, you're talking about it, you've got a good subject going, and all you get is well, yep, that's the way it works.
No, I never had that happen, but I actually had one recently where my guest was getting intoxicated at the beginning of the show, and halfway through it, he was really intoxicated, which was making the show really interesting. And I cut it down from a 3-hour show down to an hour and a half, but I had to. I mean, it was getting to the point where, I couldn't even talk to the guy logically.
Yeah, I've had the wonderful privilege. My show's only about an hour. I keep it limited so that way I can manage the airtime. But I've had the privilege of having wonderful guests on for the most part. I think the most craziest guest I ever had, and I won't mention his name because I haven't got permission, though I'm sure he wouldn't mind, is out in California. And I always have a blast when he's on the show. I have him on once a year. He's fairly well known for his house out there. But he's a handful to manage because he's a very outrageous person. He doesn't intentionally sling cuss words, though they'll come out of his mouth, but he will speak very bluntly. And he's had some bad experiences with a few TV shows, so he will speak very bluntly about that too. And I'm a big one on the show of not talking bad about anything that can get you legally sued because I'm so used to it. So we don't say anything bad about television shows. We don't say anything bad about television personalities. We don't say anything bad about paranormal teams or individuals. We keep it very professional. So I think he's been the biggest handful sometimes, but he's also the funnest guy to ever have on a show.
Oh, yeah. Hey, Michael, you remember the one, the actor and magician we had on our show back about a month ago?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was a fascinating... Actually, he was a very good interview, even though he looked kind of like emo. He looked kind of like very dark, in his publicity materials, but the guy was pretty sharp.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the first time I ever had Ron Fitzgerald on the show.
Yeah.
I mean, he's been on like 4 times. I think he's going to come on again here in about a month. We found a lot about how they make horror movies. We found about, the dark side of... being a magician, the burning coffin. I mean, we got it. It was nice. It was like we were sitting in the living room on a couch and just talking, and it went really good. And the audience ate it up, and we educated the audience and myself, and even I bet you too, Michael, about how they make the movies.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was kind of like a paranormal goth insider is what I would call him. And it was very fascinating to hear that. It was almost like you were on the inside track of an old carny, who would tell you what was going on behind the scenes. at the carnivals, that you would attend as a kid. But I would really be interested in finding out from from Chris on what he might think would be some of his best moments of radio. I remember listening to Art Bell, and I can pull a couple of shows out of the top of my head, thinking that this has got to be great radio, and go down in history. I'm sure Chris has had some of those himself.
Now, I got to say something before he does. Okay, pardon me. I know I shot you down, didn't I, Michael, when I mentioned about Mel's Hole, didn't I?
Oh, no problem. Yeah.
Okay.
I would say the second show I ever did was with a gentleman, and I know he won't mind me saying this, but he's a wonderful guy. Does a show out of Canada, Peter Sacco. He is a very memorable guy. He's a psychologist. He's done many, many books. He works with, he does a show now called Paranormal Profilers. Before that, he did Niagara's Most Wanted, which was fairly well known in Canada. But he was very, very professional. And I had to do my research on him because it was the first time. I had prepped a lot of people after him, but he was the first guy that was kind of a semi-personality before I went into some of the bigger people. And when he came on the show, he was just phenomenal. I mean, he knew what he was talking about. He loved to talk about his show. You didn't have to cue him in at all. It was a wonderful show. Outside of that, there's been quite a few unique ones, but I think the most unique one I ever had, I wasn't expecting. I had the privilege of talking to a gentleman that was related to MUFON, and he's going to be coming back on, hopefully before it's over with. And he was just a scientist, nothing big, not a major person in it, and so forth. But he became a very fascinating conversation, something I wasn't expecting. I was expecting just another one of it's the first UFO one I'd ever had. I was expecting another one of the, okay, we're going to talk about this and we're going to talk about that. And he started breaking down the science of quantum physics. He started breaking down the science of and history of how at one point we were listening to the stars, and now we don't have very many people out there listening to the stars. And I wish I would have had more than an hour to pick his brain, I guess you could say.
Yeah, unfortunately, guests like that are, far and few between. I mean, that's at least my case. I mean, I hate to say it, I do a show 5 nights a week, and, I wish I could have guests like that 5 nights a week. But, how can I say it? You kind of, at one point, have to have variety. So one night I'm talking to a mystic, or we're talking about regression, or remote viewing, or UFOs. I am kind of burned out a little bit for Bigfoot for the next couple weeks, but we'll get back into that one too.
Generally, when I've had one Bigfoot guest on, and then the rest of them were cryptozoologists. We talk about more than Bigfoot a lot of times, because if you get into some of the more in-depth cryptozoologists, I don't know if you've had them on the show or not, they try to avoid Bigfoot, Mothman. They start to get into some more in-depth stuff. I had the very first one, before I started to get into a few other names, was a young kid here in Ohio, Colin Schneider, because I do a lot of Ohio guests just to promote Ohio for the most part. And Colin is very young. He went to high school up until this year. He'll be going to college next year. And he dove into cryptozoology at a very young age. Now, he's spoken in a lot of major conferences now. He's worked with a lot of different people now. But he's an amazing kid. And when he first started talking to me, he was talking about the history of how dragons relate to cryptozoology. He was talking about how the history of cryptids and ape men can kind of relate together, and how Bigfoot is more a myth than anything else, but you can look at these things. He was talking about the Freudianship of things, and, I mean, he went way over my head. I hate to say that, but he went way over my head with a lot of things he was saying.
Wow, that's impressive for a young guy like that to be so in depth and scientific with his analysis. How did you run across a guy like that? Was he just someone who contacted you?
No, I had a slight relationship with him. My first experience on digital radio, after going off of an AM station, was with a station that we didn't work out very well on. She didn't like my format, so I went to creating a format of my own and just working with BBS and then paying for AM for a little while until I got picked up from some sponsors. And he had already been doing a radio show on there, along with several other people that I have a lot of respect for that have went on to other radio shows. So he's a very intelligent kid that was working alongside a lot of other intelligent people on the shows at the time with a very limited audience. And then he and I began talking a little bit, and I said, "Hey, let's get you on my radio show the first year, and then if you want to come back, great." And it was a wonderful experience. I learned a lot about him. He's way above the average teenager.
How old was he when you had him on at the first?
17.
Wow.
Oh my gosh.
17 years old. Yeah, and at that point he had already been invited to several major cryptozoology conferences. He had had a chance and a privilege to work with several zoologists and cryptozoologists that are very well known in the field. He had not been a public speaker yet. He just had a chance to be with them. And last year he had got up on the stage in one of the largest cryptozoology conferences that are out there, and he was fascinated with that. I wish I would have been there, but unfortunately I was out in California at the time doing filming. He's a fascinating kid. His name is Colin Schneider. If you ever get a chance, get him on. He's a wonderful kid. You'll love him.
Oh, wow.
I wonder what kind of studies he's going to concentrate on in college. That would be very interesting for a guy like that to meet with his advisor and tell him what he's interested in.
Yeah, well, the advisor might be interested in it. It amazed me how many scientists are fascinated with the paranormal in one way, shape, or form. When you first get into, of course, coming from the study end, it was easier for me, but when you first get into the paranormal, you assume that what people state is true, and a lot of people give you the statement that science and the paranormal doesn't mix, but that's not true. The reality is there are a lot of scientists that look into the paranormal somewhere along the line because the paranormal means the unknown. And, of course, they're fascinated with that. Now, they may not look at it the same as you look at it or the same as I look at it or so forth. A lot of them look at it the same way that I look at it. But they still look at it, and they're fascinated with it, especially when you deal with ghost hunting. You'll get a lot of questions going, did you really experience something you can't explain? What was it? Are you sure you can't explain it? Because it's interesting. You're dealing with things that you can't define currently, so they're in those little gray areas, and that's what people are fascinated with. It ain't human nature. You know, we're fascinated with what we can't explain.
Well, one thing I will say that I have gotten burned recently with a guest, but I have now, with some of the guests coming up, they have audio clips. And I got some software now where I can play the audio clip, do some filtering, and I can pretty much tell if it's been, messed around with or faked. And it's pretty bad when you get a guest on the show and you run their audio clips, and yeah, boy, you realize before you bring them on the show, you run the analyzer through it, you realize that it's not real. And what do you do at that situation? What would you do?
What would I do? Probably remove them from the show. I hate to say that, but I have different morals than most people. Knowing what I know about television and how you can easily, with the camera angle and a little bit of effort, you can make it look like a ghost pulled your shirt. You can make it look like a ghost moved into a room. You can make it look like a chair moved. You can make it look like a door opened up. There's a lot of things you can do that are done on a regular basis to entertain. Knowing what I know there and knowing what I know from an audio background, a lot of times this is why I'm picky on the people that I put on the show, because people will give you audio clips that they know 100% is not real. They'll give you video clips that they know 100% is not real. Of course, if you've been in it long enough, like you said, you've got the software, you know what you're looking for and so forth, you can debunk that right off the bat. So I tend to not put them on the show a lot of times and have them send me stuff ahead of time and do a lot of research on the individuals because I want real people. But what would I do if I found it out on the show?
Yeah.
I would probably politely come back and